Hi, my name is Isabella, and for my project, I decided to do the food culture of ancient Greece. So, to start off, we'll first go into ancient Greece, just a little bit of background of when and where it is exactly. Then I'll go into the environment, like the climate and just the landscaping in general. And then we'll go into the foods, like what specific components they had in their meals every day. And then we'll go into food practices, which I'll break down a little more of what each meal consisted of and a little more fun facts about eating in ancient Greece. And then we'll wrap it up with the conclusion. So we're going to start off with a little background of ancient Greece. Where was it exactly? It is almost exactly where it is today in the Mediterranean Sea, in the Mediterranean area. Um, as you can see here, all this orange in this map is ancient Greek territory in 750 BC. Um, Usually, like today, it's only confined to this area and a lot of the islands here. But this is modern day Turkey and parts of ancient Greece, expanded all the way across the sea to the coast of Turkey. But this is no longer a part of Greece, it's a part of Turkey now. So when was ancient Greece? The exact timelines, like to consider it ancient Greece, are kind of like a little fuzzy. So I just decided to pick a couple periods that I thought that would be a little more relevant to what people usually think of when I say ancient Greece. This consists of the Archaic period, the Classical period, the Hellenistic period, and Roman Greece, when the Romans started taking over Greece. And this spans from 700 BCE all the way to 324 AD. Why did I choose ancient Greece? Um, I I love Greek food. I eat it almost every week or every other week. And on top of that, I love Greek mythology. I don't know. I used to love the Percy Jackson books, and yeah. Uh, Philosophy is another thing that I'm really getting into. And I know a lot of the philosophers, there's a lot of Greek philosophers. Oops. Oh, what the? Sorry. There's a lot of Greek philosophers. And overall, I just think Greece is a really beautiful place. I've seen so many pictures, and I honestly want to go someday. And overall, I just wanted to learn more about Greece's history because I know to some extent it because I learned about mythology and I learned about philosophy, but I haven't really learned about the food aspects, so I thought it'd be like a good way to learn more. So then we'll go into environment, and this would be just like the general area of Greece. What was it like to live in the area during the time? So as for terrain, I decided to focus on three things in specific. The mountains, the soil, and the water, because these are the three things that heavily influenced food sources a little more. So I'll go over these three. Right. So for mountains, there are a lot of mountains in Greece. About 80% of Greece was it's just mountains. And these mountains served as natural borders between cities. So a lot of the cities um, they could grow individually without having to rely on each other so much. A lot of mountains were thought to be like meeting places of the gods because they were so close to the sky, so the gods could all meet there. There was because of all these mountain ranges, there was very little flat land for agriculture. And this flat land could also have been used for cattle to graze on. So there's no fields for cattle to graze on, so not a lot of cattle was being raised. Moving on to soil. Um, uh, I'll go more into this later, but the climate was really hot and dry the most of the time in the Mediterranean area where Greece is. And the soil in Greece, not the best for agriculture. It was just rocky and kind of acidic. So there was very few spots that were good enough to plant. Um, However, there were like very few spots that were good for farming. So in these little areas closer to the coast, where it was a little more flat, they would plant olives, grapes, nuts, and fruits. I'll go over this a little more later. Um, the soil is not really optimal for farming, like I said, but they made it work. A lot of the farming that was done was more so like domestic for their own families, not so much for selling to other people. But the little things that did grow in Greece, ancient Greece, they become staples and they show up in food even today. Moving on to water. Um, it's an archipelago, which means uh, it's completely surrounded by oceans. Um, so this means that fish was a very key part in ancient Greece diet, especially with the um, the lack of space for farm animals. Fish was like the main protein for all kinds of people, the commoners and the wealthy, all of them. They use spearfishing and nets to fish, and this easy access to water also allowed trades. So I have this map here of 550 BCE of the trading routes that uh, the ancient Greeks would take in order to trade with other little areas of the time. Moving on to weather, I wanted to discuss the weather also because it's a very important factor in the agriculture in general. So the climate of ancient Greece is in the summer it's very hot and dry, which means this is the time where there was barely anything able to grow because it could have been droughts. There's not a lot of water. Not a lot of things can grow in hot and dry climates. However, in the winter, it was very wet and it was rainy, which was great season for crops. So fall and winter time and a little bit of springtime, very good times to farm for the ancient Greeks. Because of the changes of weather throughout the year, a lot of the crops were rotated, especially because the amount of land that they had to plant them was very like sparse. So they had to control what plants they planted when, just because they can maximize the little space that they had. Moving on to our next section, which is foods. We're going to talk about what the ancient Greeks ate in correlation to the previous section about the environment. So, the typical Greek foods, which I can talk about agriculture first because it's a little more important, not important, but major in their diet. So, the combination of an environment and a climate made it so Greeks could have some foods and not others as part of their everyday life. 1/5 of Greece's soil was optimal for agriculture, so they obviously had to prioritize some things over the others. Where so, like compared to here in California, we had very, very plentiful fertile soil, so we can plant basically anything here, and our weather is very sunny most of the time. We don't get too dry over here. Well, we do now, but it's still pretty good for farming. So some of the main agricultural staples of ancient Greece consisted of grapes, olives, and wheat. Grapes were mostly used for wines. Olives were eaten like by themselves as olives, and also used for olive oil, which is a very big staple in Greece. And wheat, which was used to make bread, which was eaten in almost every single meal that the Greeks ate in their day. They also grew other fruits and grains, as well as beans and legumes. And I also didn't mention this, but they grew nuts, which I didn't, for some reason, I didn't know that nuts grew on trees, but apparently they do. So that's how I figured that out. So moving on to the meats and the fish, like the proteins. Like I said before, the area is surrounded by oceans, so They have easy access to fish. There was also a lot of lakes in ancient Greece, so they could go fishing in those too. So they have saltwater fish and freshwater fish. They also ate a variety of shellfish and even octopus. As for poultry, they raise chicken and geese very rarely. A lot of this, a lot of the raising animals was for the more wealthier people because they had more resources to give to their animals. Eggs were also very commonly eaten, more so towards the wealthy people, but other commoners had their fair share of eggs too. As for other meats, the most commonly found meat in ancient Greece was pork because they were easy to tend to. They didn't really need any, they didn't have like a lot of demanding requirements. They ate scraps. They had, they didn't need a lot of room. They didn't need to graze, nothing like that. But goats, lamb, and sheep were also raised by the more wealthy. These are because these are typically found more in rocky terrains anyway, so they already know how to survive. And the one thing that couldn't really be kept were cattle because cattle need large fields. Like I mentioned before, they need large fields to graze on, and there were very little of that. So cattle was very, very, very rare. Only by the wealthiest people could have cattle and have beef. Additionally, on top of this, because there was no cattle, the most of the milk and the cheese came from these former animals, the goats, the lamb, and the sheep. So we're going to move on to food culture, and we'll talk about how the food was prepared and how it was eaten throughout the day. Because the vast majority of foods were sourced locally and naturally, ancient Greeks were very healthy and they had a very balanced diet. The breakfast was very light or non-existent and entirely. If they did eat breakfast, it was probably wine and bread, and they would dip their bread in the wine. Lunch was a little heavier, but still fairly light. Think about like a charcuterie board. They would just have a little bit of everything, a little bread, a little olives, a little cheese. They also had nuts or fruits or fish. Like they just had a little bit of everything, but they didn't eat too much. They kept it light still. Oops. Dinner, um, because breakfast and lunch were so light, by the end of the day, when they're all done with their work, they're very hungry, so dinner is always heavy, and it is considered the most important meal of the day, even today. Um, they have the same components as lunch, but just larger portions. I have this little image here, which is kind of like what I was talking about before here, but it had just a little visual. Here we have breakfast, which they have the bread and the wine. And then lunch, as you can see, it's just like a little small serving of everything. They have a little bread here, and which they also dipped in the wine. They have olives and cheese and figs. Dinner here, there's a lot more for dinner. We have legumes here, olives, fish, cheese, eggs, asparagus, and bread. They just have a larger serving. Um, Dessert, I didn't really go over, but it's mostly just honey draped over everything. And yeah, this is basically, as you can see, staple. There's bread, there's bread, there's bread, there's wine, there's wine, there's wine, there's wine, olives. Yeah. So, some other fun facts about food in ancient Greece. Wine was drinking in almost every meal of the day, like I said before. Um, I see it's in every single one of these sections, even for dessert. But you might think that might be a little unhealthy, but it was diluted with water almost every time, 3-to-1 ratio. So for every 1 part of wine, there's 3 parts of water, which made it a little more healthier and more hydrating. And actually, being drunk was actually frowned upon. So drinking the wine was more so for like the taste rather than getting drunk. On top of this, like I said before, red meats were really rarely eaten by commoners. They were saved more so for special occasions, and only the wealthy Greeks could eat red meat more frequently because they're the only ones who can have them. And I found this out, and I thought it was pretty neat. Men and women always dined separately. the men would be served first, either by slaves or by women. And once the men were completely done eating, then the women would serve themselves, or the slaves would serve the women and they would eat. So, wrapping it up here, um, I talked about the background of ancient Greeks, which is in the Mediterranean area from 700 BCE to 324 AD. I talked about the environment, about the mountains and the rocky lands and the dry climate, but it has plentiful ocean. I talked about the different foods that they ate, the most important ones being grapes, olives, wheat, and fish. And then I talked about a little bit of the food culture during the time, which included a light breakfast, medium lunch, and a heavy dinner. So thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something. And here are my sources.